Good evening, everyone. Here we are for the second gathering on our pilgrimage to Israel. I am extremely happy about doing this and just so eager to share it with you that I actually found myself feeling a little nervous because it's such a wonderful story and such a wonderful experience. I sincerely pray to God and gurus that at least some of the power of it will come across to all of you. So let's begin now with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us on this inward journey, that the power of your presence will be with us every step of the way, that through music, through the pictures of these holy places, through learning about the divine events that took place, we may be transported inwardly to that timeless superconscious place in which divinity reigns. Lift us above the waves of this world and take our consciousness into the heavenly realms of bliss, of perfect love, of courage, of the power of our convictions, and the ability to remain faithful to the will of God in all things. Om, peace. Amen. Well, as I was saying last week, because we're not limited by geography or time or place or anything like that, we're doing this whole journey chronologically. So I started last week with King David and talked about Elijah and Elisha, who were those, according to the Jewish tradition at the time that Jesus was born, Elijah must come before the Messiah would come. I talked about David's tomb, but oddly, I forgot to show the pictures. But before we go back and pick up those pictures, I'd like to start with a song that will help set the tone for the whole evening. This is Swami Kriyananda singing a song of his composition, Dare to be Different.
Dare to be different, dare to be free, dare to roam far like wind on the sea, fly like a gull, soar high on the air, be strong in your courage when others despair. Never in anger, never in haste, go without pride, be never abased. Freedom is yours if freedom you give. To all give it freely, in freedom you live. Mountains that stand up tall to the sky tell us no dreaming is ever too high. Dare to defy them, brave that high peak. You'll never know failure if victory you seek. Dare to be different, dare to be free, dare to roam far like wind on the sea, fly like a gull, soar high on the air, be strong in your courage when others despair.
Listening to that song in the light of the in the context of the life of Christ, it really tells us, gives us a picture of what might be possible for all of us. Dare to be different, dare to be free. Well, I was starting to say last week I forgot to show the pictures of David's tomb. It just went out of my mind. So I'd like to start this evening by making that up. If you watched on the recording, the pictures did show, but I didn't narrate them, so we're going to show them again at this point. This is the place where Swamiji, as I mentioned last week, Swamiji went there just because it was convenient to be able to do it, not because he really had that much of an interest. David's tomb is on Mount Zion, and Mount Zion is an exceedingly, obviously you can tell by the name, it's a very holy place there. And the little building, this is not a very aesthetic picture, but the big, beautiful church is actually the Church of the Dormition, which is the place where it is said that Mary left her body. And we'll go there afterwards, but afterwards meaning later in this journey. But this, everything in Jerusalem is chock-a-block on top of each other because all the holy places are holy to everyone. So what we're looking at is the outside back of some part of the where David's tomb is. So let's go downstairs now to the courtyard. There it is. So this is a very, very old building. The tomb, which is inside, they said that there's nothing in it, but it's the spot that has been revered for countless centuries. And so at one point, perhaps it really was the tomb where David was, or the sacredness of the spot was generated by centuries and centuries of pilgrims. Master said that almost every place in the Holy Land is authentic, and I never heard him describe exactly what isn't. On this same hillside is a room that is said to be the Last Supper room, but David's tomb is down underneath. The Last Supper room is a Christian shrine, the Church of Dormition is a Christian shrine, and this is actually a Jewish synagogue. So this is, you go through this courtyard at ground level, and then you go inside through that door. And let's go in further. And then you come to a relatively small area, and because it's an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, on one side is for women and one side is for men. And it's actually just a relatively small room with a partition in the middle, as we'll see. This is the entrance to the women's side. Let's go inside here. And on the left there, where you see that gold and blue, that is what people consider to be the tomb. You can see people have pasted prayers on there, and women will stand there with their prayer books and recite. We can get 10 or 12 people in here, and just on the other side of that partition is the men's side, so let's look to the entrance. This is exactly where Swami Kriyananda was. So he walked right through these exact doors and through that doorway, and then this is the men's side. And Swami's description of sitting here was that he didn't expect anything, but suddenly he felt this extraordinary power of the grace of God from this great soul, King David, who was the sort of the origin point from which all of this extraordinary story of Jesus descends, because all the prophecy said that Jesus had to be of the house of David. So Swami wrote music for one of King David's psalms, the psalm which is simply known as the Psalm of David, although he wrote many. But this is the one that is most known, most attached to his name. So let's imagine Swami just sitting in that little black chair, communing with King David, and perhaps even hearing the melody that he put to these words. Let's listen to him sing now.
up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, who made the heavens and the earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth, and even forevermore.
I said that was Swami singing, but that was Chaitanya, wasn't that? Yes. Anyway, beautifully done. Swami's inspiration. So, my friends, now, let me just think where we are. So now what I want to share with you is what was going on in Jerusalem, what Jerusalem was like at the time that Jesus was born. So what we're going to talk about now is, let me just sort of pull this in my mind here exactly what it is. Yes. Okay, let me think about how I want to start this. I think it would be helpful if we looked at this model of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. When you read the Bible, all the different things that happened to Jesus during his time, one of the most important elements of that whole experience is the temple in Jerusalem, which was the absolute center of their spiritual life. Everybody for the holidays goes up to the temple. Jesus' confrontation with the priests and so on happened in the temple. When he's 12 years old, he's found teaching in the temple. And the definition for the Jewish people, even to this day, of the sort of the apex of when their civilization was whole and they were focused is built around the temple that was there at the time of Jesus and the temple that was built before us. I spoke about King David last week, and I talked about how King David, even though he was very blessed by God, and he established Jerusalem as the beginning of the Jewish culture there, because of his affection for Bathsheba and the way he behaved at that time, so the Bible says, David wasn't allowed to build the temple. But his son Solomon built the temple, and it was about 1000 BC that Solomon built the temple. It was the first temple of Solomon, and it stood for almost 500 years. It was then destroyed in one of the huge battles that happened at that time. Within 70 years, though, it was rebuilt, and it stood for almost another 500 years. It was built in 516 BC, and then it was destroyed in 70 AD. It was destroyed after Jesus had died, when there was a revolt. The Jewish people tried to revolt against the Roman rulers, and the Romans completely crushed the revolt, and then they destroyed the temple. They took down every stone of the temple. And it is a deeply held belief, even to this day among certain Jewish people, that when the Messiah comes, when the Messianic age begins, then the third temple will be built on that same site. And the temple that stood there massively dominated the city. And it was this, it's sort of hard, I mean, you'll see it in a moment when I show you the model. It was this massive physical edifice. And the only thing of that edifice that remains is one retaining wall, because it was built on a hill. And one retaining wall remains, and that's what, it used to be called the Wailing Wall, but now it's called the Western Wall. And it still is considered to be the most sacred spot for practicing Jews to go. And when you go to Jerusalem now, on Sabbath nights, it's filled with people, and people have bar mitzvahs there, they have weddings there, because it's the closest they can come to what is known as the Temple Mount. Now, in the way that things are in Jerusalem, after the Jewish people, the temple was destroyed, a few hundred years later, the Muslims came and they built a huge temple, the Dome of the Rock, it's called, on top. This particular physical spot is held sacred. It's held sacred to the Muslims, and it's held sacred to the Jews. The Jews believe that the foundation stone of creation emanates from that spot. That it was there that God created the rest of creation. It was from the Temple Mount that God took a handful of dust and created Adam. When Abraham was tested by the Lord and was willing to sacrifice his firstborn son, Isaac, because God had asked him to, and he had built an altar and had put his son down as the offering and had lifted a sword to sacrifice his son to God, so great was his, as the story is told, so great was his willingness to follow God's will, that even with his hand was upraised with the sword, an angel grabbed his hand and stopped him. And then a ram and a sheep was found, and the sheep was sacrificed instead. The Jewish people believe that happened right on that very spot. And that when the temple was standing there, there's the place, the Holy of Holies, where the scriptures are kept, I presume, and ordinary people are not allowed to walk in that place. And because no one knows exactly where that is on the Temple Mount, very strict Jewish people to this day don't want no Jews should walk on the Mount, lest by accident they step in the place that was the Holy of Holies, where ordinary people should not go. The Muslim people believe that it was from this very spot that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. And it is considered to be the third most sacred spot after Mecca and Medina. So now it's all filled with controversy, and the Muslims go to the top and worship at the Dome of the Rock. The Jewish people go to the wall, to the western wall, which is just on the same mountain, but just a few steps below. And so all of this takes place, in the physical world with all these endlessly confusing other factors. And it's just sort of the way of the world and the way of God just never are seemingly able to reconcile. Now, from the point of view of Jesus, when Jesus was dealing with all of this, as we progress through the life of Jesus, we deal with these two realities, these two places where Jesus' ministry took place. He would come into Jerusalem, and there would always be these confrontations with the priests who were in charge, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, how that operated. And then he would go up to the Sea of Galilee, where everything was much freer, and he would meet his disciples. And even nowadays, as we'll see when we get there, the Sea of Galilee is somewhat undeveloped. It's open air. There's a sense of lightness and freedom there. And Jesus would conduct, his ministry. He would gather his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount, the Mount of the Beatitudes, everything took place in that area. And then he would go back into Jerusalem, and then he would confront the power of the temple, which was just this huge stone edifice. When I was visiting there and walking at the Western Wall, and then you can sort of walk into an area that's less formal, but it's still the same reality. I mean, now this is centuries and centuries, but stone just endures. But just standing there at this huge wall, which isn't just the retaining wall, is not even the temple itself, you could just feel the tremendous power of fixed ideas and the tremendous power of worldly understanding of spiritual things. And you could just feel what it would have been for Jesus to have to just sort of fight against something that was so Kali Yuga in its reality. See, here we are, we're in Kali Yuga descending, and the idea of where power comes from is very much in this tremendous physical reality that the temple itself personified. So why don't we now look at this picture of this model? And this is a model that was created, it was created as a tribute by a very wealthy Israeli, as a tribute to his son. His son was killed in the Independence War in 1948. So he commissioned this, and from this side you can see the huge square there, that's the temple. And that's the rest of the city of Jerusalem. It's on a scale of like 1 foot is, 50 feet is down to 1 foot, 1 to 50 is the scale, presumably. And there was a historian, a Jewish Roman historian named Josephus Flavius, who was a contemporary of that time. And it was from his notes about how the city was and how the temple was that this was created. And he wrote in some detail. So this model now is as part of the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, and if you look across, you can see a crowd of people, which gives you an idea of a scale of it. So this was the town, and the most relevant thing is, obviously, look at the size of the temple. And you can just see how, this was the Jewish quarter, of course, and you can just see how completely it dominated. So let's take another look. This is looking from the other side. Again, you can see where the temple is, and you can see these retaining walls. I'm not sure exactly when we get to the western wall which one it is, but that's all that's left. It's not when when we see the retaining wall, it's not the city wall, it's the temple behind it that's going to be. So let's see the next. This is, again, you can see the courtyard, and on the right side you can see the doorway into probably where the scripture was kept. Forgive me for being so ignorant about this, but that's what I understand it to be. So let's switch it again. You can see again, look at the massive size of the doorway. And now just think about this. This is what, the reason I'm showing this to you is when we begin to talk about what Jesus was experiencing, and I'll tell you a little bit about the different priest groups and so on, that this is what we were working with. And everybody would go to this temple, and this was the authority. And bear in mind, Jesus absolutely challenged that authority. But look at the power and the form, and this has been here now. This stood for about 500 years, and this was the last, 70 years of this temple's existence, because it was destroyed 70 years after Jesus died. But it had been standing for centuries, and had been the center of the life there, the definition almost of what it meant to be Jewish for most people. So let's see what the next picture is. Now this, you can see the scale of this because of the people. This is a gold-plated menorah, and it's seven lights. People think of the Hanukkah menorah, which actually has the 8 nights of Hanukkah, but this menorah, you can imagine, undoubtedly stood for the 7 chakras, is where it came from, and it's the symbol of Judaism. But it's gold, and it's supposed to be modeled after one of the ornaments that was inside that temple. So not only do you have the massive stone, but you have this extraordinary concentration of wealth. And it's not so unusual. If you've ever been to the Vatican, this is exactly what the Vatican looks like and feels like. And you can see how spiritual power and material power begin to blend. So here we have another picture of the menorah, just a beautiful picture in the evening. And this is in a square in the town of Jerusalem, and this, for the people, for the Israelis who are devoted to this is a constant reminder of the greatness of their tradition and the potential greatness of their future. So you can see how much energy and concentrated force of will was focused in order to create a reality like that. And it tells you somewhat of the temperament even of the Israelis today. So let's go on to here. Now we're looking, this is modern, of course. And you see the gold on the left is the Dome of the Rock. That's the Muslim temple that's higher up on the hill. And where the people are down lower, that's the Western Wall. That's the retaining wall for that temple compound that we saw, but the Muslims have control of the top of it. Jews are allowed to go there. Some rabbis think that you shouldn't go there for the reasons I described. Jews are allowed to go there, but they're not allowed to pray. And even though that area is controlled by the Israelis, the Temple Mount is controlled by a Muslim foundation. When I first went to Israel, because of all of this, I said I'd never go back, because it was heartbreaking is the only word I could use. It was just unbearable, all of it. But when I was called back the second time, I had a completely different attitude. I thought, in such chaos, people of light have to go, because only a massive change of consciousness will ever settle this, because they're all fighting over the same things, and that's the holiest place. This, for a long time, this area was not held by Israel, but it was in the hands of Jordan, I believe, until the 1967 war, if I have that correct. But there's a place that you could go, which is some distance from here, which was an overlook where you could stand and you could look at the Western Wall. You couldn't go there because Jews weren't allowed in that area. And people would have their bar mitzvahs and their weddings on this little patio because it was within sight of this place. So the determination and the conviction. Now let's take another picture and get a little closer. So you can see the scale of this. And this is what, when I was standing there looking at all of that, and just really trying to feel what the power of Christ was like, when he was standing in that much granite stone and proclaiming a truth that was completely contrary to what was proclaimed, within those walls. And you can see why the conflict became absolutely insolvable, and the power was used to simply take Jesus away. So let's look, that was the men's side, this is the women's side. It's actually, and I have to say, it's very, very moving to be there. You see people, this is the women, they go right up to the edge with their prayer books, and I would sit back a little bit and meditate, and you would feel centuries and centuries of devotion. And regardless of theology, Judaism is a true Sanatana Dharma faith, and the power of it is really there. And people write their prayers on little pieces of paper and stuff them in the cracks in the rock. It's something that is a tradition that's always been there. So you go and you see all the little prayers, and people are often weeping for one reason or another. People bring their whole heart there to there. Now, if I will be forgiven for doing so, the song I wanted to play in relation to this one is "The Wonders That Man Did Carve Out of Stone." It seems the only song that could be sung here. So let's contemplate this stone that was standing at the time of Jesus, where Jesus himself undoubtedly walked, and feel the power, both the eternal power and the delusionary power that building in this way represents. So now, let me just talk a little bit about the context, the spiritual and religious context. At the time of Jesus' life, there were three groups within the Jewish culture. Now, the Jewish people had their world and their culture, and their part of Jerusalem, and they lived all over that area. But the Romans were in charge. They were a subjugated people, and they were part of the Roman Empire. So even though they had a certain amount of freedom, many desirable things were denied to them. So there was this constant chafing against these authorities. There was a Jewish king appointed, but they were not a free people. They were not enslaved, but they were not free. And it was a time of great political unrest. It was Kali Yuga descending. So it wasn't merely that Kali Yuga was bad, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. And then we had to get down, the nadir of Kali Yuga was 500 AD. So we were really on our way down. And so there was all this political unrest, and there was all this hoping that the Jewish people would be rescued, this expectation that the Messiah would return, the belief that the Messiah would come, the belief that the Messiah would be the king of the Jewish people And given the Kali Yuga way of thinking, they thought that meant political power, that they thought that meant that the kingdom of the Jewish people would rise again as it had in Old Testament times, that they would not only be a spiritual power, but they would be a worldly power. And so there was a constant sort of expectation and hope and chafing against the Roman rule. And then there would be zealots, there would be people who would be politically active, who wanted to rise up in rebellion against the Roman people and restore their power to them. So there was all this going on. And in the religious context, there were Pharisees, and there were Sadducees, and then there were also the Essenes. And this is, at first, the Essenes used to be a more esoteric belief, but now it's just accepted that this is what it was. So the Sadducees were a very wealthy priestly caste. You might call them the Brahmins. And they were, the way it's described is that, they were a very high level of society. The archaeologists have found that near where the temple used to be, there was an extremely wealthy neighborhood, big homes, luxurious furnishings, and it has been, and I'm going to just say these things as if they were true because this is how it's presented. It seems to have been established that this is where many of the priests lived, especially this is where the Sadducees lived. And they had a very elitist attitude toward their religion. They felt that the religion belonged in the temple. They were not democratic. Only certain priests could do it. They had become, by that point, an inherited priesthood. Swami talks about how in the original caste system of India, the positions that were held were not held by hereditary. It was the consciousness of who you actually were. And Swami describes this in terms of the Brahmins, that the Brahmins, who were the highest caste, the priestly caste, as the age began to decline, as we moved toward Kali Yuga, those Brahmins who were enjoying the high respect of their position naturally wanted it to be passed on to their children. So the beginning of the end of the truth of the Brahmin caste, from a higher age down to a lower age, is when it became inherited. Because then it was no longer a question of whether the consciousness of a Brahmin was really there, it was just inherited. So it was very interesting that the Sadducees established exactly the same thing. They were the priestly caste, they had power, the temple, as you can see, was tremendously wealthy, and the way the temple established itself, the concept of Judaism at that time was all about the law. And the law was administered by God, who was perceived to be a judge. And you had to follow all the rules. And if you followed all the rules exactly as they were laid out, then you would be pleasing to God. And then whatever rewards the faith offered you, those rewards would be yours. And contrary, if you failed to live up to them, then you would suffer whatever the negative consequences were. And so all kinds of offerings were required, rituals were required. If you wanted to do this kind of a ceremony, you had to bring these particular offerings, and they would cost this amount of money. And the tradition of the money changers in the temple, which later figures in the life of Jesus when he became so enraged, "You have made of my Father's house a merchant's house," and he chased the money changers out of the temple. Now a lot of the things I tell you, I've collected over many years from different sources. And I have become persuaded that they're either literally true or they're apocryphal. I didn't make any of this up. But I can no longer exactly tell you why I think this is so. So I'm just going to present it in this way. That there was a tradition that there was temple money. And so you would come with your worldly money from the government of wherever you were from, and you had to change that money for temple money. And that's why there were the money changers. And of course, every time you changed your money, somebody made a little profit off of your money. So the reason Jesus was so enraged is because you were required by the law to come to Jerusalem and come to the temple and make these certain offerings, but the only way you could get those offerings is you had to also participate in what had really just become a scam, a scheme to support the temple, to make it big and wealthy as it was, and to support those priests whose responsibility it was to carry out all the rules. And the whole thing, these sorts of shifts do not happen sort of suddenly. They just happen an inch at a time. And each step seems like a good step. And then finally you end up first with the Sadducees, who were very elitist and very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. And that was one whole side of Judaism. Now the Pharisees, which are not particularly praised in the Bible, Jesus speaks of the Pharisees as being hypocrites, were also an extremely powerful priestly caste. But the Pharisees are considered to be more, that the Pharisees sort of won between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So the tradition of Judaism tends to come down more through the Pharisaical line. And the Pharisees were less elitist than the Sadducees. They were still priests, they were still well-to-do, they still profited, they still had both worldly and spiritual power. But they believed, and this was their basic principle, that the Judaism could be practiced outside the temple. That it wasn't only possible to come to Jerusalem and be in the temple. This is at least how the historians explain it. They were more popular among the people because they were more of the people. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees were united in what was called the Sanhedrin. And when Jesus was finally condemned, he was condemned by the Sanhedrin. He was condemned by the Jewish people. And then he was taken to the Roman authorities to be crucified. Now I'm going to start using the words that I like to use here, because every time I talk too much about the Jews as if they were the enemies of Christ, somebody always reminds me how much horror has been done in the name of that. Because we aren't really dealing with Judaism. What we're dealing with is a corrupt priesthood. And what we're dealing with is that power and money, when it gets involved with religion, becomes very confused. And they might have been sincere, but power and money when it gets involved with religion, and just think about it, just think about that temple, think how it dominated the entire landscape of Jerusalem. Think about the festivals when everybody had to come and had to cooperate with this priestly caste. Think of the importance that these people had, just even, standing in a building like this. How could you not believe that we are the gifted of God, the special of God? And I mean, I have to say it quite frankly, the first time I went to Rome and the first time I went to the Vatican, and I just stood there and I thought, the hypnotic power of this much concentrated material energy. And then when I went into the Vatican, and of course, for centuries and centuries, nations have been propitiating the Vatican and bringing gifts and great wealth. You just walk down the hallways and there are these, in the Vatican, and there are these showcases just filled with gold and jewels and precious art pieces. And I mean, some of them are extraordinarily beautiful, but it's very hard to sort of keep an independent thought that all this wealth and material building is just wealth and material building. That why is this a sign of anything divine? But it's very hard, even in our present reality. And I have to say this, it was more especially true, 25 or 30 years ago. But one would go to Self-Realization Fellowship, and they had all these beautiful buildings and all this beautiful landscaped property and all these different things. And then you would come to Ananda, and at the time we didn't even have dirt roads. We were just a little dust mote out there. It was hard not to believe that the real spiritual power was where the physical beauty and development was. And now, the third group, though, that existed at the same time were the Essenes. And when I think about those of us who may have been there with Jesus, and it's hard for me to think that I wasn't. I can't say that I have actual memories of being there, although on some of my times there, it's come pretty close to that. But even if one doesn't think that we, the Ananda family, were there, well, if in fact Jesus was a previous incarnation of Paramhansa Yogananda, as Master, as Swami said it, he felt was true at the end of his life, then it seems all the more likely that we really were there. But in any case, because of the experience that I've had at Ananda, and because of the experience I've had of community, of Swamiji, of spiritual family, of being a sort of slightly of an outlier group that has its own interpretation that is really outside whatever the mainstream is saying, I have my own sort of feeling about what the Essenes community was like, and then people have written books, novels, history books, recalled memory, past life regression, all kinds of things about the Essenes, but more and more the historical record is beginning to match the esoteric record about the Essenes. So this is what is commonly accepted, that the Essenes were sort of an underground movement. Some of the stories have it that the Essenes were renegade, and that the Essenes were concentrated in a few isolated communities, but there were many Essenes all through the Jewish population. And when I think of Ananda, I think of it just like that. We're concentrated in a few communities where the energy is very focused, but there are many people who follow the path that we follow, just scattered among the rest of society. Now, because the Essenes did not conform to everything that the Pharisees and the Sadducees asserted, they didn't stand up. They were, as I said, they were a little bit hidden. It's a little unclear to me exactly whether it was dangerous to be an Essene or exactly what it was, but it was a parallel movement that wasn't exactly the same. And the Essenes lived in communities, and what I see the Essenes as, which I think is a true interpretation, and they were basically, let me finish this thought. The Essenes were known to have a lot of secrets. That's the word I was trying to use. They were somewhat of a secret society. And it seems to me that the Essenes were the Sanatan Dharma remnant of Judaism. Because we are descending from a higher age, and as we go from a higher into a lower age, that which was self-evidently true in a higher age, the knowledge of it becomes lost and the understanding becomes lost. So you can sort of see a bifurcation where the Essenes kept the mystical tradition. They kept the understanding of inner communion, whereas the Pharisees and the Sadducees gradually went to the worldly side of the teaching. Now, I don't think it's untrue to say that Ananda has the mystical side of Christianity, and there is also the church side of Christianity. I know at a certain point after Swami wrote the oratorio, he said to some of us, we mustn't let anybody own the word Christian. He said, we have as much right to be Christians as others do. In this context, I had told him about an experience I had with the minister of a Protestant church in the area, where we rented, before we had our own church in Palo Alto, when we had this big event for Master's birthday, we rented their sanctuary. And we used it beautifully for the event. But when I went back the next year to rent it, the minister had heard something about what we did, and it was quite exaggerated. Somehow a sacred cow was involved in his idea of it. I really have no idea what he heard. But he wanted to talk to me before he would rent it to me again. So he asked me a little bit about who we were and what Ananda was, and I told him that we had an Indian guru, but that our Indian guru taught from both the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. And he said to me, well, he doesn't presume to call himself a Christian, does he, like that? He said it like that. And I said, he most absolutely does. And by this point, I didn't want his church, even if he gave it to me for free. I said he draws his inspiration directly from Jesus. He doesn't draw it through any church institution. And I mean, that was the end of it, of course. There was no chance of using his building. Later on, some of his congregation members apologized to me for him being, because he was so narrow. But in that context, Swami said, we mustn't let others define what Christianity is. We have a perfect right to do so. So I feel like at the time of the Essenes, you had the Sadducees and Pharisees who had the worldly power, who had the real estate, and had the respect of the masses, but the Essenes were holding the true tradition. And they separated themselves out from society. Now this, of course, this is Kali Yuga descending. You don't build for the future in Kali Yuga descending because nothing's going to last. At the nadir of Kali Yuga, the barbarians just went through. When you read the book about the yugas that Purushottama and Vyasa wrote, at the nadir of Kali Yuga, the barbarians just came through and swept everything away. There was no point in building. So the Essenes separated themselves out into desert communities, and they lived very differently. They lived communally. And the Essenes are one of their most famous communities was Qumran, and we'll see pictures of this, which was way out in the desert, and it was the place eventually where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And a lot of what's known about the Essenes and a lot about that time was from the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, some of what they say about the Essenes, it just doesn't make any common sense to me. Endless ritual bathing, always dressed in white clothes, a kind of rigidity about how they lived. There's dispute about whether they were a celibate community or whether they were families and women and children. There seems to be good evidence that there were women and children, and there could have been a celibate priesthood, but by no means was it entirely a celibate community, although some will assert there were. Now, part of the tradition of the Essenes was that the Messiah was going to come and that the Messiah was going to be born into their community. And as when we get closer to the birth of Jesus, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they were always, as all Jewish people were, they were always getting ready for the coming of the Messiah. But there are many traditions that say that Jesus was, in fact, born into the Essene community, because that was the community that understood who he really was and what he was really there to do. So when Jesus was standing powerfully, and bear in mind, everybody involved in the life of Jesus was Jewish. None of them, the separation between Judaism and what became Christianity came after Jesus died, and was really because of St. Paul. We can talk about that a little bit later. But when Jesus was standing in the temple, asserting what he said to be true, he was standing in the Essene tradition. And if it is valid, which I believe it is, that the Essenes were the one who kept Sanatana Dharma alive. So he wasn't solitary. That's what I'm trying to say. It wasn't like Jesus just appeared from nowhere and had these wild ideas about what the truth really was. He was part of a very large community of people. And there's many people who talk about Jesus' travels and much that he did, that he was going from place to place, meeting other Essenes, and that the Essenes were the one who held his ministry together. Now, I don't think it's far-fetched, because I think exactly about what Ananda is. Think about us. We're here, we are. We're proclaiming a new Messiah. We're proclaiming the coming of Paramahansa Yogananda as an avatar for Dwapara Yuga. We're saying that a whole new reality has been born. And the practices that we present, they're consistent with Krishna, They're consistent with Jesus, but they're not endorsed by either. But we're standing in a tradition. We're standing in a tradition of Sanatana Dharma that was carried to us by an avatar that appears to be contradictory to what other people define as those traditions, but it isn't. It's just the essence of those traditions restored. It's important to understand this also in the context of India. When I first went to India, not just as a pilgrim, which I did for many years, but after Swami moved to India in 2003, and at whatever point it was when I started giving satsangs there, which was a few years, maybe around that time or a few years later, it took me a little time to realize. At first, I was, well, you know, we all, not all of us, but certainly I, also have very deep Indian samskars. It feels quite normal there for me. When I was in the city of Varanasi, which at that time, especially in the late 80s, was very uncongenial with traffic and all these other things. It had everything in it that I wouldn't enjoy. And I was absolutely blissfully happy the whole time I was there. It was just a memory. It was just a feeling of, from the soil, that this is home. But I also had tremendous respect for the Indian culture, for Indian people. And when I first started teaching there, well, now there's two parts to this story. I'm going to back up. I'm going to stop this one and go back to the first one. In 1986, when I first went to India, leading a pilgrimage there to a country I'd never been to, but we were going to all the places that were sacred to Master and Ramakrishna and other things I did know well. I was able to be a quick learner. But I thought we were Hindus, so to speak. Let me say more. I thought we were Indians. I'd been living at Ananda village at that point for 16 years, but during the first 10 years especially, when Swami Kriyananda himself was still much more in the Indian bhav. He was closer to his own time in India. In the summer he would go around in a dhoti with a bare chest and just a rudrakshamala. He wore his hair long. He often sang Indian chants. He gave us all Indian names. We're especially living up at the meditation retreat, which would have been my first few years. This was before we put white stones down on the paths, which you might not think was really such a big thing, but it was a big thing, because prior to that, it was soft dust and you could walk barefoot all everywhere. Once they put down white stones, you had to wear shoes, but you could walk barefoot. So I walked barefoot through the forest, you know, to go into the temple where Swami was singing all these Indian chants, and we were dressed in Indian clothes and had Indian names. It was really a forest ashram from some other era. And that bhav, even though it had shifted a little by the mid-80s, that bhav was still there. So when I went to India, I thought we were Indian. And it was really startling for me to realize when I saw Hinduism, which I'd never seen Hinduism. I had only seen Swami present Sanatana Dharma. And when I saw Hinduism, I realized that we were about as Hindu as we were Catholic, which was not very. But nonetheless, in my self-definition and in our self-definition, we were the legitimate heirs both to the tradition of Krishna and to the tradition of Jesus. So we weren't standing on the edge, we were standing in the center. And then when I went to India years later, which is where I was, to present the teachings of self-realization, I was very, very respectful, which of course one should be, but I just thought every Indian knew more than I did. And of course, many would volunteer to reinforce that impression because they knew so much more about so many things, just even how to pronounce some of the words. And when you would mention some tiny aspect of Lord Rama's life or some little incident from the Mahabharata or something like that, someone would raise their hand and just give you, volumes of detail that were fascinating and wonderful that I'd never heard of. And I felt quite intimidated for a time. But gradually I realized that the self-realization teachings of Master and of Swamiji were true Sanatana Dharma, but they were not Hinduism. And it took me a while to appreciate in the right way that I really had something to offer, because we were all trying to come out of Hinduism and out of Christianity and go back to the original teachings. And even though culturally, and in many ways they were far more well-informed than I was about certain things, I had been trained in the self-realization teachings of Master, which were simply different. They were not contradictory, but they were different. They were very different. Now, I say all of that because when I look at the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Temple of Jerusalem and the hundreds of years of tradition and the expectation of the Messiah and the Essene community living in the middle of that, sort of defining itself in a completely different way, but not politically. They were completely apolitical, is how it's described, which is, well, until the recent election, I would have said that's also true of Ananda, but we're not thinking about transforming society. We're thinking about transforming ourselves and being close to God. And that's what really matters. So that's what the Essenes were concentrated on. There was also a very interesting just comment from one of the contemporary historians of that time. And it was put like this: the Essenes had more affection for each other, meaning within their communities, the bonds of friendship and of love were very strong, much stronger than the Sadducees felt for each other or the Pharisees felt for each other. And it was such an odd comment when I read it, but I thought about that. And again, it reminds me of Ananda, that we're sort of bound by this completely other understanding that makes a circle around us. And so we move through society as a whole, but we move very differently. And then, in many traditions about the life of Jesus, as I was saying, Jesus was born into that community, and that community was the power and the strength of his ministry. It wasn't just he alone trying to create this from nothing. And when we talk about Saint Anne, who was the mother of Mary, who became the mother of Jesus, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So right now what I'd like to have us look at is that we have some pictures of Qumran. And Qumran was one of the most well-known of the Essene communities because it was here that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. So Qumran is out in the desert, and it's about a mile from the Dead Sea. So we'll have pictures, and you'll get a very powerful feeling of what's going on here. Swami, there's also, I'm not showing them to you, but when Swami went to here, this is where he sat in that desert atmosphere, and as he talked about, just sort of drilled down through different layers to feel the consciousness of what really happened here. So let's look at the pictures. This part, when we go out to the desert of Qumran, those of us who have these kinds of samskars, the heart is just absolutely delighted when we begin to think about this. Now, you go through a sort of visitor center, and then you get past that, and behind it you come to these very barren hills. Now, we'll see in a few moments, you'll see some ruins of what they think was built up there. But there are also many caves in these hills, and many people believe that many of the people in these communities, especially probably the monks, actually lived in the caves, and then just would come down to the central area for meals or for meetings or for gatherings of different kinds. So let's see what comes next. Okay, there's one of the just little caves that you could see from down below, and I can certainly see myself in there. I'm sure some of you watching this can also see this. And we can see the next one. And you're allowed to walk. Sometimes when I was there, we were allowed to walk. If it's raining, they're afraid of flash floods, but when it's dry, you can just scramble through these hills if you want to. Okay, let's see what comes next. This is a picture, it happens to be Kirtani meditating there, but you see right behind her, you see the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is, I believe it's the lowest spot on earth, and it's very salty, and it's very famous. And so you can just imagine that living in this, on this hill, in these rocky hills, but the vista that you would see also goes out and stretches across this body of water. So let's now look at, these are some of the ruins. This is all that's left. The archaeologists always try to guess what these are, but these are just the buildings that were built there of stone. Nothing much is left from them. Let's see the next one also. This is, water was of course a big issue. They always call this a ritual bath. One of the novels that I read about the Essenes, I have to admit I was a little skeptical. In the particular story of the Essenes, just before basically they did anything, they all had to take a ritual bath and they all had to change into ceremonial white clothes. My practical mind thought, who does all the laundry? Ceremonial white clothes, if you just have to always be changing into new, clean, ceremonial white clothes, you would have to have half your population would have to be doing laundry all the time. However, ritual bath is a very important part of the Jewish tradition, so whenever they find anything that looks to them, because there's stairs going down into it, it helps reinforce the idea that this was that kind of a community. So now let's move the next. This is actually this is made up. This is not authentic, but this is a recreation of the jars in which the scrolls were hidden that were later found that became called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what happened here was, it's assumed that just before the temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were dispersed across the world, their whole culture was taken down by a failed revolt against the Romans, and the Romans just obliterated them, that the Essenes, who were the keeper of the secrets and the scribes and so on, they put a great many of their documents, their scrolls, into these pottery jars, and they stuck them deep into the caves. So this is a recreation of one of those stashes that was accidentally discovered when a young goat herd tossed a rock into a cave and heard pottery breaking. And so he went in to see what was there, and that led to this discovery, which was contemporaneous writings from the time of Jesus about the Essene community, which was, of course, not so much known at that time. Let's see another picture here. These are actual fragments, and I don't know whether these are authentic fragments or recreations. These might be actually authentic fragments. There is another place in Jerusalem. There's an extraordinary museum dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which the architecture is of a huge, huge pottery jar with a lid, and you go down and you go into the pottery jar and you can see the walls, and they have all these displays of the scrolls. It's brilliant architecture, and you stand in front of these, and just, hundreds of years ago, a scribe in one of these communities just sat and wrote these. Now, those of us who believe in reincarnation, of course, I always think, am I looking at something that I myself wrote? And sometimes I think we are. Why are we drawn back to certain places and certain things? So now let's go back. We're going to go back outside in the next picture. I was going to show a closer picture of the caves where we lived. I'll just say it like that. So we can imagine ourselves living in one of those caves on one of those cliffs, looking out over the Dead Sea, having withdrawn from the worldliness of the temple world in Jerusalem, out of a very, very deep desire to be closer to God and to practice these teachings more deeply. So what I wanted to listen to while we look at this beautiful picture of Christ is Swami's song, Cloisters, with Swami's voice.
Long I've called you, my Lord, long I've called you. Many years I have longed for your sight. bathe the darkness with tears of devotion, offered candles in prayer to your light. How much longer, friend, must I cry your name? I am yours, ever yours. Will you come? Long I've called you, my Lord. Long I've called you. Many years I have longed for your sight. Bathe the darkness with tears of devotion, offered candles in prayer to your light. How much longer, friend, must I cry your name? I am yours, ever yours. Will you come?
Now we've sort of set the scene of what was going on at the time of Jesus, what he was facing within the reality of the people he came to serve, because he came to restore, to enlighten, to uplift. The rest of the world around him was pagan. The Jewish people were the only remnant of Sanatan Dharma. And Sanatan Dharma was truly alive among many of them. So now I want to talk just a little bit about Saint Anne. She's called Saint Anne now. Anne was, now among the Essene community, it was their own prophecies. I mean, within the Essenes, their belief was that the coming of the Messiah was very close. And they believed that a woman among them, one of the women among them, would become the mother of the Messiah. And there was a tradition in the Essene community that there were many girls, young girls, who spent their childhood in the temple, or in training to be. They were not priests exactly, but what am I trying to say? They were dedicated to spiritual life, and they were brought up in such a way that their entire focus was towards spiritual life. And it was one of the reasons that those who felt guided by God that that's what they were supposed to do, or their parents felt guided, or the child themselves did, was because they were keeping themselves pure and ready in the hope that one of them would be the mother of the Messiah. So there's stories, and some of it is legend, some of it is scraps of history, about a woman named Anne. And Anne was a deeply devoted Essene, and she became married, and she prayed. You know, every woman prayed who had that spirit in her, that she could be the one who would be able to give birth to the one who would save the people, who would uplift the people. And she had a child. She had a daughter, and she named that daughter Mary, but that daughter died. And then when the next child came, Anne had a vision that told her that the child she was going to give birth to was not going to be the Messiah, but that child would be the mother of the Messiah. At least that was Anne's intuition from God. So when that child was born, she named that child Mary again, for the child who had been lost, and began immediately from a very young age, she began to prepare that child to go and live at the temple. So it's said that at the age of 4 years old, little Mary went to live in the temple and to be brought up by the priests and the sisters. Who knows what the exact reality of it is, but it was all in the context of the Essene community. It wasn't that they had gone over into the other reality. They were all living within the Essene community, training themselves spiritually and making themselves ready. Now, there's a church in Jerusalem that is dedicated to Saint Anne, and I think we'll look at the pictures here, and then there's a beautiful statue that's related to her. So why don't we start looking at the pictures of Saint Anne's church now? So this is it from the outside. It's a substantial church. It happens to be French, of all things, and it's sort of a French enclave in the middle of Jerusalem. And when you go inside, let's go walk inside to it. It's a very nice church because it's very plain. I mean, there's beautiful churches filled with artwork, but this is very, very plain. And that's the view from the altar looking backwards. And then let's look the other way, and then we'll look at the inside. That's the altar going up toward the front. The claim to fame of this church is that the acoustics are really extraordinary. So just to, bring you into our experience, when we were there, we were a choir, just because we always are a choir. And we just stood there and sang for a very, very long time. Choirs just line up to sing with all that stone around it. And then let's see the next picture. Yeah, the next one. This is actually, you can see stairs going down. So we were in the main sanctuary, and off to the side, we go down these stairs, and let's see what the next picture is. And you get to this cave grotto area. Now, it is said that this is where Mary was born, where St. Anne gave birth to Mary. Like many places, there are other places who claim that. All I can say is, it was extraordinarily powerful down there. We all meditated there for quite a long time, and we could really just feel some profound stillness in that atmosphere. We can go a little closer to the painted icon on the wall. I can't decipher it for you, but it's beautifully done, and done with a great deal of devotion. There's several babies there, and I'm not quite sure which is which. But when you go down into these more underground places, because that's the natural stone there, and whatever spiritual atmosphere has ever been there, it's really held in the rocks in a magnificent way. So we're going to go back upstairs now, and there's a statue. And this is a statue of St. Anne, and the little girl with her is Mary. And St. Anne, the way the story was told, as I understood it, is that she would see Mary, once a month or so, but Mary mostly lived away from her. And just interesting, when Anne finally had a third daughter, she also called her Mary, because one Mary had died, one Mary had been given to God. And then this Mary was the Mary that Anne got to raise, which is why later in the story, you have Mary and her sister Mary. And that's sort of why that happens. This statue, for some reason, there's something exceedingly dear about the child and Mary both. So while we look at this statue, let's listen to Swami's beautiful song, God is Truth. One of the things that happens when you go on pilgrimage to Israel, which in a certain way was quite unexpected for me. You know, when you think of Christianity, you do have Mother Mary if you were Catholic, but the feminine force, because of Mary and Mary Magdalene, are such powerful figures in the life of Christ. And then there was also Saint Anne, that there are shrines, including that grotto there at St. Anne's, where I've meditated a lot, and it's really extraordinary there, where the feminine aspect of God is exceedingly powerful. The Church of the Dormition, which we saw briefly looking at David's tomb, and there's another place which is considered to be the tomb of Mary, which is right near the Garden of Gethsemane. Everywhere you turn, you're feeling this feminine power, that the life of Jesus is inextricably bound up with the life of his mother. And when you hear this story of Saint Anne and this expectation that someone would be the mother of the Messiah, and next week we'll continue on with this about the angel coming to Mary, her understanding of what was going to happen to her, and the role she played with the disciples after Jesus' passing. You really can't separate the two. There was this extraordinary, powerful feminine presence all through the life of Christ, all through his actual life, not just sort of afterwards, but the force that was there. And it lends a particular sweetness to the whole experience. When we go to the Stations of the Cross, which come much later, of course, when Jesus was walking the Villa Dolorosa. But there's a point at the beginning of that when he's walking to his crucifixion, and he meets his mother. And there it is. There's just this moment. He meets his mother, and then she walks along behind him. So that realization that there she is, and her own mother became a saint, was a saint, and there they were in the context of this whole community that knew it had this destiny. And here's this little girl who in herself must have known who she was, and her mother knew who she was. And all of that's going to unfold. So why don't we end this evening by just listening to, one of Swami's really beautiful songs. I've passed my life as a stranger.
I've passed my life as a stranger, Lord, roamed far in foreign lands, far, Lord, far, too far. Only he who knows he's far from home, only he, Lord, understands. Only he who knows he's far from home feels the earth and understands. Sometimes a stranger did take me in, then love I thought was near. Love, Lord, where is love? As the winds upon the desert sand whisper hope, then disappear. As soft winds breathe on the desert sand, so love sighs, then disappears. Sometimes a child laughed and I did pause, and dreamed of joys at home. Joys, Lord, only a dream. For what joy is there without your smile, empty like the ocean foam? For what joy is there without your smile? You're the sea, all else is foam. How long must I be a wanderer, Lord? You know where I belong. You know, Lord, yes, you know. Home is where my Lord's sweet presence is. I've grown tired of strangers' songs. Home is where my Lord's sweet presence is. Bless me that I hear your song.